It was a quiet morning in December 1994 when an elderly woman hiked into the misty hills near the city of Ningzhou in Guangxi province. She was just there to gather wild herbs, something she had done countless times. But that day her foot caught on something soft, something human. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. There, lying in the damp grass, was the nude body of a young woman. Her clothes were folded neatly beside her. No signs of a struggle, but her eyes, wide open and clouded with terror, told a story that words couldn't. The smell of decay was unbearable. Insects had claimed most of the remains. By the time investigators arrived, the body had already begun to decompose. Her identity was a mystery. Her face was damaged beyond recognition. No missing person reports matched the description. And in 1994, DNA testing wasn't a tool that small-town police could rely on. Still, forensic teams managed to recover traces of biological material, including semen. But without a name, a suspect, or even a clear timeline of death, the case was quietly shelved, filed away as one of those unsolved mysteries that time tends to forget. Except time didn't forget, because over the next 6 years, more bodies would surface, one after another, always female, always young, always left with eerie tidiness, as if someone had taken care to make them look like they hadn't suffered. But they had. Someone was watching these women, luring them, and ending their lives coldly, methodically, without remorse. I can't help but wonder how many people passed this man without knowing what he was capable of. Who was the Phantom of Guizhou? And why did it take so long to stop him? When the body of the first unidentified woman was discovered in 1994, it was terrifying but isolated. A tragic anomaly. That's what most people believed. But 3 years later, in 1997, another woman was found. Same general region, same method. Her body abandoned in the wilderness. No signs of struggle, her clothes once again folded beside her. And once again, no suspect, no ID, no resolution. This time the police couldn't dismiss it. Something darker was taking root in the hills of southern China. From that point on, the killings came in waves. In 1998, 2 more victims were found. In 1999, 2 more again. But by the year 2000, things escalated. 5 women were murdered in just a few months, this time in Duojun, a small city in Guizhou province, neighboring Guangxi. A pattern was becoming clear even if the suspect wasn't. All of the victims were women between the ages of 18 and 30. Most were discovered far from city centers, on hillsides, in forested trails, or in abandoned fields. Their clothing was always nearby, folded or placed deliberately. There were no signs of robbery or sexual mutilation. And oddly, in several cases, the women had condoms in their purses, an unusual detail that puzzled investigators at first. The attacks bore the hallmarks of someone calculated, someone who didn't act on impulse, but on strategy. At first, police suspected these women might have known their attacker. But as it turned out, there were no relationships, no connections. Many were living alone, working at night. Some were later discovered to be involved in street-based sex work, a fact that hadn't been reported by families if their disappearances had even been reported at all. You might think that this would narrow things down, but in a time before widespread surveillance and digital tracking, these women were essentially invisible. Local law enforcement found themselves overwhelmed. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no forensics advanced enough to link the scenes. The only recurring clue was the presence of biological material, traces of semen found on several victims. But even that couldn't be cross-referenced, as China's DNA database at the time was still limited, especially in rural areas. I can't help but think, how many more cases went undetected? Eventually, the gravity of the situation forced action. In late 2000, the regional police departments of Guangxi and Guizhou formed a joint task force. Dozens of officers were reassigned to the case. Patrols were increased. Flyers were distributed. But without a name or a face, it was like trying to catch a ghost. What unsettled investigators the most was how little the victims seemed to resist. No scratches, no defensive wounds. It was as if they'd willingly followed their killer, perhaps even trusted him. That trust, it turns out, was precisely what he relied on.
because over time, investigators began to piece together a chilling modus operandi. The women weren't kidnapped, they were lured.
He approached them with small talk, pretended to be a railway worker, claimed he knew where they could make some money playing cards or visiting a friend's place in the mountains. He was soft-spoken, clean-shaven, and calm. Some even described him as respectful. But once they reached a certain point, once they were far enough from help, the real man emerged. And he didn't just want power, he wanted control.
Police were chasing a phantom, someone who moved between provinces, switched identities, and killed without leaving a trace. He left no fingerprints. He never struck the same place twice. He even kept his crimes spaced out enough that they didn't initially seem connected. But by 2000, it was impossible to deny. 15 women had died. Possibly more. A serial predator was moving freely through China's heartland, and no one could stop him. The media began calling him the Wolf of the Hills, and for years he remained untouchable, until one woman got away.
She didn't just survive.
She hunted him down.
And her name was Malin. It was just past 2 a.m. on a cold November night in 2000 when a young woman burst into a police station in Duojun, disheveled, shaking, and barely coherent.
Her name was Malin, and what she told officers changed everything. She had been at a neighborhood mahjong parlor earlier that evening when a man approached her. He was polite, well-dressed in a train worker's uniform, and strangely familiar. He spoke gently, even joked a little. Malin assumed he was one of the regular players, nothing threatening.
He invited her to another poker game, promising bigger payouts. There's a private table behind the train station, he told her. You'd like it, easy wins, rich players not far. And in that moment, Malin, like many others before her, followed.
But something felt off. The man led her away from the city toward a narrow path leading up a hillside. Malin asked where they were going. He smiled and said the card house was just ahead, but the trees grew thicker. The streetlights disappeared, and then, without warning, his tone changed.
Take your clothes off, he said coldly, or you'll die right here.
She froze. At that moment, she understood the stories that never made the papers, the girls who went missing, the fear that had seeped into this region for years. He was the one. But Malin didn't scream, not at first. She pleaded, she begged. She even tried to reason with him, saying, "I won't tell anyone, I swear." Oddly, it worked. The man hesitated, lit a cigarette, started talking about how women deserved what they got. He rambled about betrayal, about hate, about how he'd killed before, and no one ever caught him. And Malin, she listened, pretending to sympathize while scanning the forest for any chance to run.
Then fate intervened.
The man's phone buzzed on the ground. He turned away to check it. In that split second, Malin bolted into a patch of thick brush and didn't look back. The attacker panicked, thinking she'd run down the hill, but Malin had wedged herself into a shallow trench and stayed perfectly still for nearly an hour. Once she felt safe, she made a break for it down the mountain through empty streets straight to the nearest police station. But even with her incredible escape, the case was far from over. When officers asked for a description, Malin did her best. Tall, lean, slightly graying hair, soft-spoken, a scar near his right brow. But the darkness had made everything blurry, and trauma has a way of reshaping memory. The facial composite created from her account was rough. Investigators launched a massive manhunt, questioning over 7,000 men, many from the railway sector, but nothing stuck. The attacker had vanished again, like smoke. Still, Malin couldn't forget him, and she couldn't rest until he was caught. In the months that followed, she walked the streets of Duojun every chance she had. Shopping districts, markets, anywhere a man might blend in. She didn't care how unlikely it seemed. She needed to see his face again.
And then on May 8, 2001, she did.
At a crowded market, Malin spotted a man walking hand in hand with a woman and child. He looked ordinary, smiling, like someone's husband, someone's father. But to her, he was unmistakable. Malin followed them quietly until they sat down at a restaurant. Then she ran straight to the police. Minutes later, officers surrounded the location. As they closed in, the suspect tried to flee. He grabbed a knife and threatened a nearby diner. But when he saw his wife and child trembling, he lowered the blade and surrendered. The man gave his name as Guo Longhai alias, a railway supervisor, a family man.
But the survivor sitting in the next room knew better.
And when the DNA came back, it confirmed the truth.
He was the phantom of Guizhou.
When the man calling himself Guo Longhai was brought in, he looked anything but monstrous. Mid-40s, slender build, quiet, composed. He even carried himself with the kind of mannerisms you'd expect from a civil servant, mild and deliberate.
He denied everything.
"I've done nothing wrong," he said. "This is a mistake."
And at first glance, it did seem like a stretch. He had a wife, a child, a steady job. He wasn't a drifter or an outcast. He looked like someone you might nod to in the morning without thinking twice. But when officers cross-referenced his name with local records, they found something chilling. Years earlier, Guo had served 7 years in prison for a rape conviction. Back then, he was a young factory worker. The incident involved a woman from his workplace, Liang, a woman he had become obsessed with. She had turned down his advances, rejected him, and in a moment of anger, he forced himself on her.
When word got out, Liang reported him. Guo was arrested. His family, highly respected in their railway community, used every connection they could to reduce his sentence, and they succeeded. He got out early on good behavior.
Some say this was the real tragedy, that a predator was let out before he was ever truly held accountable.
After his release, Guo returned to a life that outwardly looked stable. His wife had waited for him. His son was growing up. He got a low-level position in a government-run supply company. Over time, he even earned a promotion. But beneath the surface, something had festered. According to psychological experts who later reviewed the case, Guo harbored intense resentment not just toward Liang, but toward women in general. In his mind, they were to blame for his downfall, for his public humiliation, for everything. He once told investigators, "Women aren't good people. They betray, they lie, they ruin men like me." His first known murder was opportunistic. It happened while he was on a business trip to Luzhou in 1994. He saw a woman who resembled Liang. He struck up a conversation, paid her to follow him into the hills, and when she asked for more money, he snapped. It was in his words rage and release.
But once he got away with it, something inside him shifted.
Guo began targeting young women who lived on the margins, sex workers, night shift salon workers, girls without family nearby, women he could lure with charm, then dominate with force. He saw it as reclaiming power, and he believed the women deserved it.
Over 6 years, he perfected his approach. He'd wear disguises, railway uniforms, business suits. He'd memorize city routes, use local dialects. He'd never strike the same area twice in a row. And he always cleaned the scene meticulously. He became what criminal psychologists call a disciplined predator.
When Meilin's testimony and the DNA results finally cracked, the case investigators were horrified to learn just how far it had gone.
Guo admitted to 15 murders plus 1 failed attempt. He even bragged about it.
Zhang Jun had a whole gang and only killed 10, he said, referring to another infamous serial offender. But me, I did 15, alone. That wasn't guilt talking, that was pride. And then came a twist no one expected. Among the many names and faces Guo could recall, there was one that stuck out: Nguyen, a 13-year-old girl with developmental challenges. She wasn't like the other victims. He hadn't meant to kill her, but one night he found her wandering alone. She was talking to herself, lost in her own world. At first he planned to let her go, but then he changed his mind. She had seen his face. So he did what he always did. I can't help but pause here. Because it's one thing to hear about patterns or psychology. But when you hear about a child, someone so defenseless, it changes the tone. It stops being a case study. It becomes grief.
That grief would echo through the courtrooms in the months to come.
But Guo didn't feel it. Even during his interrogation, he smiled when he recalled certain details. When asked why he did it, he said, "They were easy, and nobody missed them."
But one woman did miss him.
His wife.
She cried when police knocked on their door.
Because she didn't just lose a husband that day, she realized she never really knew the man beside her. The trial of Guo Longhai was not public. It couldn't be.
The crimes he had confessed to were so brutal, so deeply rooted in predatory violence, that local authorities chose to conduct the proceedings behind closed doors. Victims' families needed protection. Survivors deserved privacy. And public fury was already reaching a boiling point.
Inside that quiet courtroom in Duojun, Guo sat calmly as the charges were read. 16 criminal offenses, 15 lives taken, multiple instances of non-consensual contact, premeditated murder, abuse of power, deception. He didn't flinch, not once. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence, indisputable matches taken from recovered samples across multiple crime scenes. They also included survivor testimony from Maylene, who, despite the trauma, chose to attend the proceedings. She watched him with burning eyes. He avoided her gaze entirely.
Then came the photographs, the timelines, the maps tracing his movements across the provinces. A chillingly neat pattern emerged. Cities, months, victims, everything aligned.
Guo's defense tried to argue diminished responsibility, citing psychological trauma from childhood and his earlier prison sentence. But it was weak, and everyone knew it. This was not a man lashing out blindly. This was a calculated hunter. A man who had waited, planned, and struck with terrifying precision. Still, through it all, Guo never showed remorse. When asked if he had anything to say in his own defense, he paused, then simply replied, "They deserved it. I only regret the one who got away." I remember reading that line and sitting in stunned silence. The court reporter didn't even know how to process it. Because what do you do when someone not only admits to unthinkable crimes, but boasts about them?
In the end, the judges reached their verdict swiftly. On November 15, 2001, Guo Longhai was sentenced to death by firing squad. There would be no appeals. He accepted his fate calmly, even proudly.
But one moment pierced through the coldness.
Hours before his execution, Guo, who had refused all family visits up to that point, made a quiet request. He asked to see his wife and son.
They came. A guard who witnessed the moment later described it in an internal report. Guo, usually stone-faced, broke down in tears. He told his wife, "You always stood by me. I don't deserve you. I'm sorry for everything." His son, just a teenager, stood silent, staring, betrayed. And yet, even then, Guo couldn't bring himself to admit why he'd done it. He told prison staff, "I wanted to be remembered, like a name people would never forget." On the morning of January 13, 2002, Guo Longhai was taken to the execution grounds outside Duojun. The skies were overcast. A crowd gathered in silence. Some were victims' families. Others were local residents who had lived in fear for years. The gunshots echoed through the hills he once haunted.
Some applauded.
Some wept, and one woman, his wife, collapsed to the ground, sobbing. The man who had terrorized 2 provinces was gone. But the shadows he left behind would linger.
And for the families who had waited years for answers, justice had come, but at a cost they never should have paid.
In the weeks after Guo Longhai was executed, the city of Duojun slowly returned to life.
Markets reopened. Hillside trails that had once been avoided were walked again. Mothers no longer clutched their daughters when they stepped outside. It was as if a curse had lifted from the region. But peace, as we know, doesn't erase pain.
For the families of the 15 confirmed victims, and possibly more still unknown, closure didn't come with a verdict. It came with grief long overdue. Many had spent years not knowing what happened to their daughters or sisters. Others had blamed themselves. Some had been too afraid to report them missing, worried they'd face shame or accusations. And some never even had the chance. Their loved ones simply vanished into the silence of the hills. I can't help but think, how many of them were quietly forgotten? One of the saddest truths that emerged during this case was how vulnerable the victims had been. Most were young women working under the radar, many involved in street sex work, others in unregistered salons or massage parlors. They were often invisible to the system, and that invisibility is what Guo exploited so well.
He knew no one would come looking.
He knew how the law worked, where the gaps were, and how to mask himself behind a uniform, a fake smile, and an empty promise. It wasn't just a failure of morality. It was a failure of infrastructure, a failure to protect. After Guo's arrest, both Guangxi and Guizhou authorities began tightening oversight on missing persons reporting. Special attention was given to vulnerable demographics. Interprovincial cooperation was improved. Forensic resources were upgraded, and the public was urged finally to speak up when something felt off. But still questions linger. Why didn't Guo's past conviction flag him earlier? Why wasn't there a stronger system in place to monitor offenders who had a history of violence against women? Why did it take the survivor Malin to do what an entire task force couldn't?
Some say fate chose her, that she was the one meant to stop him. But I wonder, should that burden have ever fallen on a young woman just trying to make it home?
One officer, years after the case closed, reflected in an interview, "He killed with silence. He vanished with silence. But the silence around these women, that was the real tragedy." Cases like this leave deep psychological scars on communities, on families, and on the people who investigate them. I imagine every detective who worked that case still remembers the maps, the photos, the long nights, wondering if they'd ever find him. In the end, Guo Longhai got what many feel he deserved, but in a strange and unsettling way that was exactly what he wanted: attention, a legacy.
He once compared himself to fictional killers from movies. He believed he was better than all of them.
But he wasn't a mastermind. He was a predator who knew how to hide. And it took one woman's courage and the weight of 15 lost lives to finally drag him into the light. So the question is, if it happened once, could it happen again? And would we even see it coming?